Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Maureen Schwer, and welcome to our webinar on the gut-brain connection. I'm going to start with a little bit of housekeeping here. This webinar is sponsored by Sierra Tucson. For questions and answers, you can submit a question at the bottom left of your screen at any point during the presentation. All questions will be answered during the last 10 minutes of this program. You can find a PDF of the presentation and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. If you need help or assistance, feel free to email Melissa at the email listed below. This webinar is presented for credit. To receive credit, you must watch the program all the way through, including the question and answer section at the end. Do not leave the console or leave this presentation if you want credit. Please continue to stay on the platform and you will be automatically redirected to an evaluation landing page. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2020, you will need to create an NAACC-ME account when you are first redirected to the landing page. For all subsequent webinars you attend, you will already have an account and you will just need to log in. After completion of the evaluation, you will be able to download and print your certificate. This credit is only available for the live broadcast. So back to the slides that I have put together. I am, as the Director of Integrative Services at Sierra Tucson, I'm responsible for a staff that includes massage therapists, craniosacral therapists, acupuncturists, naturopathic physicians. We truly are an integrative facility. And I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of information on naturopathic doctors and naturopathic medicine because I love what I do and I think this is an important field for people to be aware of, but there's often confusion about what a natural or integrative practitioner is. So there are actually 6 schools in the United States and 2 in Canada that have 4-year medical degrees in naturopathic medicine. This slide is from our association, and it just overviews the kind of education that we have. It's comparing the first 2 schools are naturopathic schools with Yale University, Johns Hopkins, and the Medical College of Wisconsin. So I think the overall message is this. I think in many ways my training is the best of both worlds. I learn about anatomy, biochemistry. I learn how to diagnose and treat from an allopathic perspective. But I also have a lot of additional training in nutrition, in herbs and supplements. And my overall view is that the body's natural state is health. And so I'm always trying to find the most natural way to put everything together so that people will need less medication and less supplements. I think by the end of this presentation, you'll have a much better idea of what naturopathic medicine is about because you'll understand how I think about something. So this is just a quick overview for naturopathic physicians. We are currently licensed in 19 states, and this map does a really nice job of showing this. The dark green are states where we are not only licensed, but there is some form of insurance coverage for our services. So as you can see, the coasts are more heavily, we already have the licensure there, but this is a growing field. And I think it's important for everyone just to recognize that because I believe that whether we're treating someone for addiction or for mood disorders or for abdominal discomfort, it's important to look at the whole person and to look at all the different parts. And as a naturopathic doctor, I was really trained to do that. So I'm going to start with a case study. And this woman was actually one of the first people I ever treated when I was a naturopathic doctor. And she was a 46-year-old female. She came in with depression. And she had a history of some trauma in childhood, but she'd done a really good job of building a good life. She had a family that was stable and supportive. She had a job that she loved. When I talked to her about her history, she'd had times when there was some depression, but it was more situational. Overall, depression wasn't a big picture for her most of her life. So at age 46, she had started to gain some weight, and at the time, the no-carb diets were super popular. And so she decided to go on one of these no-carb diets. And when she did, she started to lose weight, but she started to feel off, kind of tired. Her mood was sort of down. And at that time, she went to her OBGYN for her annual appointment. She told her about the depression and feeling off. She also told her her menstrual cycle was off. And the doctor decided at that time to put her on birth control pills in order to normalize her menstrual cycles. So once she started those birth control pills, the oral birth control pills, her depression worsened severely. She became so depressed she couldn't go to work. She wasn't able to really get up and out of bed. And it was really at this point that she came to see me. So I'm wanting you guys to understand sort of how I think about someone like this. So I think what happened with this woman is that initially she was doing okay. When she went on that no-carb diet, one of the things is that B vitamins are very important. We need B vitamins to be able to make our neurotransmitters and our hormones. So when she went on that diet, she didn't have enough B vitamins available to be able to make those neurotransmitters, which is why she probably felt off. She probably would have got by just feeling kind of icky for a while, but once that birth control pill was put on, it really destabilized her. And so that's because birth control pills, typically, most oral birth control pills are high in estrogen. So as women get older, they end up in perimenopause. And perimenopause, typically hormones start to drop, both estrogen and progesterone. But with women, especially with their stress, often progesterone will drop more quickly. So she probably already had too much estrogen compared to progesterone. And when she added that birth control pill, what happened is her estrogen levels became really high compared to her progesterone. And so the depression, I think, really came out of a hormonal imbalance. And once she had that, then she actually was prescribed an antidepressant, but it didn't really work all that well. I think part of that is that she was still super low in B vitamins because she was still on that diet. And so she didn't really have the building blocks to create serotonin to help her antidepressant work properly. So what I did is I discontinued the birth control pills. She didn't care about regulating her cycle and didn't need to be on it. And then I tested her hormones. And what happened is that indeed her progesterone was very low compared to her estrogen. So what I did there is I put her on bioidentical progesterone. I also gave her a really high quality B vitamin, and I asked her to modify the diet. I told her it was okay to avoid simple carbs, but that she needed to have some complex carbs like whole grains like brown rice, quinoa, in order to help her have some of the B vitamins that she needed. And what I really found is actually within a week, she turned around. She was a completely different person. And so I think that this case study helps you understand how I think about things. It isn't about just treating the symptom of depression. I was trying to go back and figure out what really caused this and how do we actually fix that. So today we're going to talk about the effects of how the gastrointestinal system, how our gut really affects mood. And there's three big areas we're going to talk about. The first is nutrient absorption. The second is the enteric nervous system, and the third is our intestinal microflora, or our gut bacteria. So this is just a very quick, simplified version of our digestive tract, and this just shows all the different nutrients and where they're absorbed throughout that digestive tract. What happens in America is we tend to sort of believe that there's no relationship between what we eat and how we feel, but that's not true at all. So all of these nutrients, we need each and every one of these to feel okay. Every cell in our body, every neurotransmitter that we make, every hormone that we make is created from the building blocks that come through our digestive system. And so if we don't have those basic building blocks, we're not going to feel well and we're not going to do well. And when we add medications on top of that, they often don't work all that well because we're just missing some important basic pieces that our body needs. So this is the methylation pathway, and there's a part of me that really loves biochemistry and all the details of this. And what you can see here is this pathway is very important. It creates serotonin. It creates, which is so important for mood, it creates melatonin, which we need for sleep. It creates glutathione, which is our major antioxidant. This is a very important pathway, and what you can see here is all the different nutrients that are part of it. So folic acid, if we don't have enough folic acid, this pathway won't work. B12, zinc, magnesium. So if any one of these cofactors, these pieces are missing, we're not going to be able to make some very important nutrients that we need to feel well. So I wanted to add a little bit of the specifics on this, looking specifically on alcohol. So one of the things that I see is that for individuals, so often what happens is they end up with this sort of feed-forward loop. Just the other day I saw a woman, and she was super highly successful person, was doing well in her field. When COVID hit, that took away some of her support system. And then what happened is she started to drink a little more alcohol to help relax. It became that sort of treat at the end of the day because she couldn't have her normal social network. The trouble is that once that alcohol is in place, it starts to mess with things. One of the things that happens is that people stop eating well. They stop taking care of themselves. Once that alcohol's on board, they're less likely to eat a nutritious dinner or get out and exercise. But also very specifically, alcohol does a lot of damage to the body. So it decreases the pancreatic enzymes that we need to break down our nutrients. It actually damages the cells to the lining of the stomach and small intestines, and it starts creating some very specific nutritional deficiencies. And one of those big ones is thiamine deficiency, and it does this in just multiple ways. It decreases the intake of thiamine. It stops its absorption into the cells once it is there, and then inside the cells it even impairs the utilization inside the cells. So what we see is that once alcohol is on board, what often happens is there's this feed-forward loop where it starts to have secondary effects on how we absorb some important nutrients and how we utilize those. Then what happens is because of that, we don't make the proper neurotransmitter, so then our mood is down, which often leads to more alcohol intake to try to improve that, which can lead to more problems. So it just becomes part of this feed-forward loop. Alcohol is often, in order to get rid of it, the body turns it into an aldehyde, which is a poison. And so the body will always prioritize getting rid of that aldehyde to save us. And in doing so, it often means that we end up with some really big depletions in other important nutrients. So this was a really interesting study that I looked at that I wanted to share with you guys. So what they did is they looked at individuals who had had chronic alcohol use, and then they were doing some studies on their gut bacteria and whether or not they had inflammation in their GI tract, which can lead to permeability, meaning molecules get into the body. And what they really found is that with chronic alcohol use, a subset of these individuals had some really high elevated inflammatory markers in their body, and it was between 40 and 60% in their initial readings. And what they found is that people who had that high inflammatory markers they tended to have more depression, more anxiety, and more cravings. Over time, what they found is as the gut healed, because they abstained from alcohol, that in some individuals these markers would start to drop. But some of them it still remained high. And so what they were seeing with this is that the damage from alcohol in some individuals causes inflammation in the GI system. Once that happens, that inflammation in the system is related to inflammation in the body. And what they found is once that process starts, until you really heal that process, people are going to have an increased depression, anxiety, and I thought it was interesting, increased cravings. So these individuals are more likely to go back to using again. So we talked about absorption and nutrients, but now we're going to talk a little bit about the actual, the way that our GI system is linked to our brain. So before we are born, as an embryo, as we're developing, there is one set of tissue that as we develop actually separates. And so one set of tissue separates and half of it becomes our digestive system and the other half becomes our brain and our spinal cord and our nervous system. So our digestive system and our nervous system were initially one tissue. And as they separate, they actually continue to have a connection between them called the enteric nervous system. So our gut and our brain are very closely linked through our nervous system, and I think we know that. So In our vernacular, we have all of these words like a gut-wrenching experience. It feels like you were kicked in the gut, or butterflies in your stomach. I think that sadly all of us have probably had that experience where someone told us news and it literally felt like we were being kicked in the gut. So this system is really important for our survival, and the human body was actually developed initially. One of the main things that our physiology does is it changes very quickly if we think that there's any danger. So usually when we talk about the nervous system, we talk about the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system too. And this is that, somatic and autonomic nervous system. And so I'm sure most of you are aware of the autonomic nervous system, the fact that our nervous system is always in a state of either rest and digest or fight and flight. So we are wired so that when we are afraid, when we feel our life is in danger, our body goes into this fight or flight mode. And when we go into fight or flight or freeze, what happens is the first thing our body does is turns off unnecessary functions. And a huge energy sink for our body is our digestive system. It takes a lot of energy and blood flow to be able to break down nutrients and absorb them. So the minute we think we are not safe, our body actually turns off our digestion. So the problem with this is that with chronic stress, I've worked with people where their digestion system has not really been online properly for maybe 20, 30 years. I've worked with some people where I feel like they've never been in that parasympathetic mode, that rest and digest mode. They just have never felt safe in the world, and that has huge implications for our digestive tract. It's really impossible to digest properly if we don't feel safe in the world, and I think so many people don't. So that goes, I think a lot of you are probably aware of this book, The Body Keeps the Score, where Dr. van der Kolk talks a lot about the science of trauma and how trauma really changes our nervous system. So this is a simplified version of some of what he talks about in that. So this is sort of a simplified, the big circle is my version in here of the brain. And so there's three parts to our brain: the brain stem, which includes the hypothalamic pituitary axis. That HPA axis is a part of our body that when it's activated, it sends messages, for instance, to our adrenal glands to release epinephrine, norepinephrine, like cortisol, the adrenaline release. And on top of that, we have our limbic system, and that's our emotional brain. And Dr. van der Kolk, in his book, talks a lot about the amygdala. And so the amygdala, he calls it the fire alarm. All external sensory information that we get from the world, what we see, what we hear, what we feel, our brain actually sends it through the amygdala first to decide safe or not safe. And what happens is when we have stress, especially childhood stress, it actually changes that amygdala, and that fire alarm starts to go off to everyday things. I know that, like, growing up, I had a lot of stress. My father was an alcoholic. I kind of lived in a chaotic world, and for me, even when things are positive, if I have a positive thing, if someone gives me a new, better office, it kind of freaks out some part of my brain because part of me has been set up to think any change could mean something bad might happen. And so when that happens, it means that even with positive change, I go to that stress response and my digestion's offline. And that has big implications for how we feel. So here's just a little bit more about the limbic system, the fire alarm. Also, the anterior cingulate cortex, I think it's really interesting. This part of our brain actually sits between our limbic system and our cortex and prefrontal cortex, our kind of logical brain, and it's the part of our brain that is activated when we think we're in danger. It tries to figure out what to do. And so I really think of this as the worrying part of the brain. And so for so many of us, when there's been addiction or trauma in our lives, what happens is this part of our brain is always thinking. So I know my anterior cingulate cortex, for instance, is always, if there isn't anything going on really for it to solve, it makes up worst case scenarios to try to figure out what I could do. So this part of our brain will often go into that worrying mode. When people say that they're worriers, what's happening is part of their brain's always trying to figure out what if. Like, what will I do? What if I lose my job? What if I My kids don't do well in school. What if there isn't enough toilet paper? Like those sort of worrying pieces. And again, when that part of our brain is activated all the time, it sends signals down through that hypothalamic pituitary axis, and it'll affect our immune system, it'll affect our sleep, it'll affect our digestion, it affects so many things. So this is just an overall slide of the autonomic nervous system. I think many of you have seen that. You can see on the left-hand side the parasympathetic, and the sympathetic is on the right side. So sympathetic is that fight or flight or freeze. Parasympathetic is rest and digest. And you can see that when we're in that stressed response, it affects our eyesight, how our pupils are, it affects the saliva in our mouth, our heart rate, how our breathing goes, how our digestion goes, how the liver releases glycogen and glucose. That's part of the reason why stress causes weight gain, is under stress the body shoots out a bunch of glucose because it thinks this person needs to run away from something dangerous, it better have a lot of food around. And then the adrenal glands, and then even bladder function. And that's part of why people will say when they're really stressed, they'll feel like they have to go to the bathroom all the time. So when I was doing research for this, what I found is a lot of articles that associated different gastrointestinal concerns, different GI things with mental health. And one of the big things I saw was irritable bowel syndrome. What they found is that irritable bowel syndrome, which is the syndrome where individuals will experience digestive upset, pain, they'll have either loose stools or constipation, it may go back and forth, it can be really severe and almost debilitating, or it can be mild and irritating, but it's a very common digestive complaint, and it's highly associated with stress. So what they found is once people developed irritable bowel syndrome, that they had an increased subsequent risk of developing depression, anxiety, insomnia, and even bipolar disorder. The risk was highest within a year, but even 5 years out, they still had an increased risk of developing one of these conditions. They also found that people with bipolar who had high anxiety and depression, what that meant is that it wasn't well controlled. That people who had bipolar that was not well controlled, almost a third of them also said that they had irritable bowel syndrome. So it's highly associated with that. So when I read this, so often the studies would say, well, we don't know why this is, there's an association, but they seem to run together, just like we don't know why they're hanging out, but you might want to send someone to a gastroenterologist or think about this. I see it as a real possibility that there's a direct link. What I am suspicious is happening here is that once digestion goes offline and people develop irritable bowel syndrome, it means their digestion's not working. Once that happens, they're going to have increased inflammation, they're going to digest their food more poorly, they're going to not have the nutrients or the vitamins that they need to make neurotransmitters. And with all of that, I think that it's more likely that they're going to be able to develop other problems. There's a link between that. If you're not absorbing or digesting well, it's hard to feel well. And so I am always talking to people about their digestion. When someone comes in, whether it's for addiction or for anxiety or depression or an eating disorder, I talk to them about digestion. And I always work on putting digestion back in place, because they need all of those pieces to really be healthy. So the third area, we talked about nutrition, the absorption and nutrition. We talked about how the nervous system can turn off digestion. And then the third is actually gut bacteria. And this is one of my favorite new areas of study. So we have about 100 trillion microbes in our GI system. It's 4 to 6 pounds of bacteria in our gut. And that's actually good. We were designed to have that there, and these bacteria are our friend. And what we're really beginning to understand in the last 10 to 15 years of research is that the number and type of bacteria that we have in our digestive system have some huge implications for our health and well-being, and I'm going to go through that. So one of the big things that's changed is in the last 10 or 15 years, we've developed DNA tests and now even RNA tests that we're able to take a sample and a stool sample and run it through DNA analysis, and we can quickly and easily understand what kind of bacteria are there and in what numbers. And that's led us to be able to do a whole bunch of really interesting studies to understand how these bacteria are affecting our health. So our gut bacteria are beneficial in many ways. One of the big things is that it actually helps in the development of our immune system. 70% of our immune system is actually in our GI tract. When we are born, before birth, we are sterile, and our digestive tract has these little places called Peyer's patches. And what happens is through the birthing process, we are supposed to be exposed to the bacteria from our mother, and that this bacteria starts to teach our immune system what to do. Our immune system, one of the important things our immune system does is it fights the bad guys, but the bacteria and the virus that we don't want. But it also is very important that our immune system doesn't fight everybody. If we have I think of our immune system, part of it is sort of like our military. If our military can't tell invaders from preschool teachers, we're in trouble. And so our immune system needs to know, oh, this bacteria is bad and I need to fight it, but it also is important that it doesn't set off a huge immune response when we are exposed to everyday household bacteria or when we're exposed to milk or a carrot. And so that tolerance of our immune system, the bacteria actually are there to help teach our immune system what to do. So secondarily, they crowd out pathogens. When the good bacteria are there, there's not room for all the bad bacteria to take hold and cause problems. C. difficile is a bacteria that is sort of present in a lot of people at some level. And it's called that because it's difficile to kill. But what happens is, for instance, if you have a big infection or a car accident and you go into the hospital and you get the hardcore broad-spectrum antibiotics, what will happen is it kills off all the good bacteria in our gut. And then what can happen is you get a superinfection of C. difficile that can be really difficult to kill. So what we're finding is that these bacteria are really important to keep us healthy. And when we have the good bacteria, even if we're exposed, if we eat a little bit of food that has maybe a little bit of bacteria that could cause food poisoning, if we have the strong bacteria there, they often fight it off and we don't get sick. So nutrient production and absorption, a lot of important nutrients and molecules are actually created by our gut bacteria. Vitamin K, some of the B vitamins, and also some short-chain fatty acids. And those are actually really important in lowering inflammation in our body. And the last is neurotransmitter production. What we're finding is gut bacteria actually create some important neurotransmitters, or the precursors that help our mood. So serotonin is so important. If we don't have enough serotonin in our system, the world just feels like a deep hole that we can't get out of. So in order to create serotonin, our body first, in the gut, the bacteria take tryptophan, which we get from protein, and it breaks it down to 5-HTP, 5-hydroxytryptophan. If that step doesn't happen, we can't absorb the 5-HTP, we aren't going to have enough of it around. In our body and our brain, we churn that 5-HTP into serotonin. So GABA is that feel-good, relaxing neurotransmitter. It's our major calming neurotransmitter. And so far we found 7 types of bacteria that actually create GABA in the gut. So it turns out that bacteria are actually creating GABA. And I am really wondering, anxiety is so much more prevalent right now in our world. I know some of it is COVID, but even before that, I've noticed, my son is 20, and I noticed that so many of his friends have anxiety. So many more people have anxiety now than I observed when I was a 20-year-old. And I am suspicious that that just the poor gut bacteria that are out there because of our food and because of antibiotics, et cetera, may be contributing to all of that. So this is a study. They started doing studies to look at this, and one of them was with germ-free mice. So they actually took mice and they did a C-section before the mice were born, and then they kept them in isolation so that they were not exposed to germs. And what they found is that these germ-free mice had overactive hypothalamic pituitary axis. So what happened is when they were stressed, they would overreact to stress. And one of the things they also found is with these germ-free mice, when they added Bifidobacterium infatis, is a very common bacteria that is prevalent in babies, in human and mice. And when they added that, it actually normalized the response. So they were over-anxious, overreacted to stress. When they gave them this, the probiotic with this bacteria, it normalized and they became like other mices. They also found that the germ-free mice had lower levels of noradrenaline, which is important for mood, and the 5-hydroxytryptamine. So do gut bacteria make mice brave? In this study, they took a bunch of mice that they'd actually bred for anxiety. So they bred anxious mice to more anxious mice until they got a whole bunch of mice that were very anxious. And they could tell this because they hide in corners, they don't come out to get food, they don't run mazes. So they took a group of these mice, and half of them they gave them a broth with Lactobacillus rhamnus for 28 days, and the other half they did not. And what they found is that just adding that bacteria decreased fear in these mice. So even mice that were predisposed to being fearful produced less cortisol, they showed less stress response just because of the addition of the lactobacillus. So epigenetics. So it turns out that when you think about our DNA and our blueprint, that things are more complex than originally we were thought. The old school thought was that our blueprint, our DNA, is just our DNA, and whatever happens, it'll be read in the same way. What we're really finding is that our DNA can contain these often copies of genes that will show up or not depending on what's going on in the environment. And this makes sense to me. Even if you think of the DNA as a blueprint, if I have a blueprint to a beautiful house and I have that house built by a bunch of builders who are highly skilled, they're working in a good climate, they're well fed, they aren't stressed, they have everything they need, I'm going to end up with a beautiful house. If that same blueprint is read by and built by a bunch of builders who are in a high-stress environment, they don't have the tools they need, they don't have the nutrition to feel well or do a good job, I'm going to end up with a really different house. And it's the same way with our DNA. So one of the things that they're finding is that actually the kind of bacteria we have in our gut actually changes the way we read our DNA. And so they found that gut bacteria change the expression of genes in both human and mice intestinal tracts. And they found that these genes that are affected are often involved in immunity, nutrient absorption, and energy metabolism, as well as that intestinal barrier function. So that's that gut-brain barrier. And that intestinal barrier function was one of the things I talked about with the alcohol abuse, how they found that people whose intestinal barrier was damaged had more inflammation and they had more depression, anxiety, and cravings. And so what they're finding is the kind of bacteria in our gut actually change the way we read our DNA, and that affects all of these areas, our immunity, our metabolism, and this really important barrier that is important for our inflammatory process. So most of the effects were in the small intestine, and they actually found that in these studies, when they would give probiotics, when they give the positive bacteria, they would then be able to see that the way they read the genes changed, and they would find changes in the cytokines, the molecules in the body. So there have been studies. I just listed out the different areas. These are all different diseases or disease processes that they have found a relationship between the gut bacteria and the disease process. So autism, obesity, diabetes, Alzheimer's, asthma and allergies, Crohn's disease, hepatitis, many autoimmune diseases, peptic ulcers, cholesterol levels, cancer, atherosclerosis, and more. So, and I haven't updated this slide for a year or two. Basically, there's so many areas that we are now finding that the kind of bacteria that we have in our gut changes the disease process for individuals. So inflammation. Inflammation is an important part of our immune system, and what should happen is inflammation is really there to help us heal. So, for instance, if I sprain my ankle gets swollen, it gets kind of red and hot, and what happens is that's the inflammatory process. My body is pulling in all of these cells from my immune system to break down and get rid of the damaged cells, to bring in healing cells to help my ankle heal, this whole thing. What happens, though, is that if that inflammatory process becomes chronic, if there's inflammation even when So if that's great. If I sprain my ankle and my ankle is super swollen and inflamed, and for the first 3 or 4 days, and then maybe less so for 2 or 3 weeks, that's going to help my ankle heal. If 5 months later my ankle is still swollen and irritated, that's not good. That's that chronic inflammation. So many of the diseases that we see being so common today, such as heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, and I would also say depression and anxiety, we're finding a link between high inflammatory markers and depression, is that when that's going on, one of the first places I look is the gut. Often what I find is that treating the digestion helps to lower inflammation in the whole body. So fiber, when we eat fiber, fiber is a natural part of whole foods, vegetables, fruits, beans. The bacteria in our gut actually take that fiber and ferment it and break it down and create these short-chain fatty acids. And those short-chain fatty acids, like acetate, butyrate, propionate, they are absorbed by the body and they lower inflammation throughout the whole body. And so dysbiosis, having the wrong kind of bacteria, also not only are they not creating these important short-chain fatty acids, but the wrong kind of bacteria can actually create toxins that cause more inflammation in the body. And so there is a direct link between our digestive tract and inflammation. So this is really interesting. When they're studying Alzheimer's, they're now calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. And that's because they found that dysregulated blood sugar levels, like high inflammation in the body, increase the risk of someone developing Alzheimer's. So one of the ways they study Alzheimer's is they inject D-galactose into the bloodstreams of mice. And when they do, they find that it causes inflammation in the brain that looks a lot like Alzheimer's. And so they use this to be able to study possible treatments. So in this study, they did that. They injected all these mice with D-galactose, and then with some of them, they gave them a probiotic, a good bacteria, and some they did not. And so they did this for a while, and then when they looked at the mice, what happened is after the mice were dead and they looked in the brains of the mice, what they found is that those that had had the probiotics did not show the inflammatory damage in their brains. And so somehow giving that probiotic actually stopped the inflammatory process, even though they had induced it. And follow-up studies have actually shown that good gut bacteria, whether that's through probiotics or whether that's through using fermented foods like yogurt or kombucha or sauerkraut, that those good bacteria actually are protective of the brain, and that there was some correlation between good gut bacteria and less Alzheimer's. Drug metabolism. So also what they found is that when you give someone a drug, the kind of bacteria they have in their gut really changes how that drug is metabolized. And so metabolism is the breakdown products of that drug. So far, there have been studies that have shown all of these, L-DOPA, which is so important for treating Parkinson's, digoxin, simvastatin, think how common that is, and many other drugs. And so what they found is that they act differently in the body according to what's going on with the gut bacteria. And the thing is that so many medications have not been tested, and so that means we don't really know how that is affecting so many medications. So comorbidity with IBS. So what they find is that irritable bowel syndrome has an overlap in our system with GERD, gastrointestinal reflux disease, which is like heartburn. So when someone has IBS, almost 65% of them have heartburn and GERD. 48.7% have dyspepsia, like stomach upset. Over 40% of them have chronic headaches. 22% of the people with IBS have fibromyalgia. And look at this, anxiety and depression were found in 81% of the people who have IBS. So irritable bowel syndrome and what's going on there is really important to treat if we're going to be looking at someone who has anxiety and depression. If their digestion is off, I think it's really important to be treating it. So I'm going to very quickly go through these slides just for time. So small intestine bacterial overgrowth is sort of a new big thing that we're looking at. And what you see is that people who have this have the same symptoms of IBS: bloating, pain, constipation, diarrhea. Sometimes they have difficulty gaining weight. I've seen sometimes they gain too much weight, but they can also have muscle pain, fatigue, irritable bowel syndrome, also interstitial cystitis, restless legs, food intolerances. Like, there's just so many things here. So basically what's going on with this is small intestine bacterial overgrowth is that something, whether it is stress, antibiotic use, eating a food that we're intolerant to. If we're lactose intolerant, we keep eating dairy, it's going to mess with us. What happens is that the wrong kind of bacteria end up living in our small intestines. And these bacteria give off toxins that cause secondary problems like diarrhea and constipation and irritation in the digestive tract. They also can give off toxins that can lead to muscle pain and fatigue. And so this is sort of one of the places I think where there's a big relationship here. Once you have this small intestine bacterial overgrowth happening, it causes all these secondary problems that cause more nutritional deficiencies and more inflammation and more problems. And so this is just an area, I don't have time to go into all of this today. I think I need to do a second digestive series on this, but this is an area, this is part of where I think all of these symptoms start to really have a big impact on our health. So I'm going to skip through this. So I'm going to go to this piece here. So these feedback loops, what I find with individuals so often is that there's this feedback loop that causes problems to get worse and worse. So often starts with something stressful happens. It could be losing a job. It could be having an automobile accident, the death of a parent. Something stressful happens, though. And one of the first things that happens is that people are stressed. So remember, it affects their enteric nervous system. So their digestion's off. They're having this real big stress response. Often then they stop eating healthy foods. I know I do. I tend to go to this like processed foods. Carbohydrates make you feel better. So then we start to kind of eat worse, and then that causes more digestive problems. Often in the stress of things, then someone gets sick. So you have something stressful happen, you start eating worse, you start eating more sugar, your immune system's off, and then maybe you get the cold and that turns into pneumonia, and then you start taking antibiotics. And the antibiotics kill off the good bacteria in your gut, and then that causes some small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and then your muscles start hurting, and so you start taking pain medications, and that causes more inflammation in the gut. And then maybe you have some digestive upset, so they give you proton pump inhibitors for heartburn. Now you're not digesting your food. I mean, all of this, and then your bacteria, it changes the bacteria in your gut, and then your good bacteria are no longer there to create the GABA or the serotonin, and so your mood gets worse. So you start maybe getting some more alcohol to help you feel better. Like, I see this pattern with individuals, like one stressor starts taking people down. So I usually do my best to look at what's going on. I look at the important places in someone's life, like when did stuff start getting worse? What did you do then? How would your diet change? Educating people, having them understand this is really an important piece to be able to get them back on track and understand how this is. Because in the same way, if something stressful happens and instead you decide it's really important because of the stress to eat well, so I'm going to increase the vegetables in my diet, I'm going to do miso soup, I'm going to exercise more, then that can lead to a positive feedback loop that makes people feel better. I think having people understand how these diet and lifestyle changes really start to impact things is so important. So I'm going to end with this little case study. So I had a 34-year-old woman who came to see me. She was actually here at Sierra Tucson. She had depression, anxiety, and a history of trauma. So she had taken an antidepressant medication for over 10 years, and actually it worked quite well. She had a job she loved. She had a supportive family, lots of friends. The medication worked well. Everything was good. And then she got a new boyfriend. And so she met this guy. She really liked this guy. I think he was good for her. And that was all good, but then they became serious and he got a job offer across the country. And she decided that she loved him enough to move. So she moved. She moved across the country. She no longer had the job that she loved. Her friends were not there. Her support was not there. And she moved to a part of the country that had very different weather than she was used to. And so it was really cold and damp, and so she was under a lot of stress. She didn't have all of the support network she normally did. She didn't have her job to make her feel good. That was triggering some of her trauma. And then she moved to this cold climate. With all the stress, her immune system was off, so she got sick. What happened is she got sick. She got, well, and actually this is the deal. So although she did get sick, that isn't the story she told us. When she came to see us, she said, I moved across the country, I was kind of stressed, and then I started having all these negative side effects. My medication stopped working, so I quit taking it. And once I did, I just became really severely anxious and depressed, and that was really the place where she came here. So when she came here and she said that, I asked her, you know, when you got depressed and anxious and when that medication stopped working, what was going on? And so what she hadn't told us before then is that when she moved, she got sick. And she got pneumonia, and she got really severe pneumonia. And she went in, was put on antibiotics, they didn't help, was put on additional antibiotics, they didn't help. And so she was sick for a month or two. And during that time, she started having all these side effects, like digestive upset, restless legs, nausea, muscle pain, and she decided that all of those side effects were from her medication, and so she stopped taking her medication. And so I think what happened is that she got sick, she was on all these antibiotics that really messed with her digestion. She developed small intestine bacterial overgrowth that was causing all these symptoms. She decided the symptoms had to do with her medication, and then she stopped her medication, and then she just nosedived. When we did a test, she had iron deficiency, low vitamin D. Those are easy tests to run, and what I find is once people's digestion is off, often their iron and their vitamin D are some of the first two nutrients that will show up in blood tests to show me that there's a problem with digestion. So what I did is I treated her SIBO. I treated her. Berberine is a natural antibiotic. It's an herbal antibiotic. I gave her peppermint oil to kind of calm her nervous system and her digestion. It also kills off the bad bacteria. I gave her a B complex. Women under stress often need additional B vitamins. We did iron and vitamin D. After a couple of weeks, when her digestion was better, I put in the good bacteria, the probiotic, and Saccharomyces boulardii is a prebiotic. It's a yeast that actually kills off candida, and it helps to feed good bacteria. We did some dietary changes. She actually was someone who did better without dairy. I think that's part of why she got sick with the pneumonia and why it stuck with her, and we added more vegetables. The genetic testing actually showed that her original medication would have been okay. Although she was put on a new med, I actually think her old med would have been fine because I think the problem was her digestion and all of the symptoms from that. I think that she thought it was her medication, but it wasn't. And I find that to be a really common thing. People often say, oh, I had all these side effects, so I stopped my meds. But when I ask them the details, they aren't really side effects that make sense for that medication. Often there's something else going on. People will often associate it with their medications because they're afraid their medications will make them sick, and then they'll stop their medications, and that just can cause this whole downward spiral. So very quickly, and then I'll go to questions, what do you do? I mean, I think number one, we need to really start thinking about our gut bacteria, and we need to be friends to our gut bacteria. And so probiotics are fine. Taking probiotics, like taking the good bacteria, are a good way to quickly kind of support your system, but in the end, fermented foods are better. And so if you go back to our grandmothers, all of these cultures had fermented foods. In my culture, my grandmother actually used to make sauerkraut in our hallway. Whether it's yogurt, kimchi, all these fermented foods used to be part of everyone's diet, and they're really important. I had said kombucha before. Kombucha, you need to be careful because it can have an alcohol content, so if anyone has any addiction problems, I never recommend kombucha. But yogurt, sauerkraut, these are all good options. And also just eating whole foods. When we process a food and make it shelf stable, what we do is we do additives. We add things to it to make it so that bacteria can't break it down. That's what we're doing. Preservatives stop bacteria from breaking down the foods. The problem is that when we then eat these really processed foods, our gut bacteria can't break them down either. So we're meant to eat real foods, whole foods, foods that are not processed. So lots of fruits and vegetables, to have like high grain breads, high grain cereals are important. These things over time will make a difference. So there was a study that was done with probiotics. So what they find is if you haven't really sort of killed off your good gut bacteria and you have a lot of dysbiosis, if you give someone probiotics, it will temporarily change them. It's a good way to kind of quickly change things. But as soon as you stop them, the goodness goes away. What they did is they studied a bunch of individuals who had a very standard American diet, high in processed foods and carbohydrates, low in fruits and vegetables, and they tested their gut bacteria. And people had a lot of dysbiosis, the wrong kind of bacteria. And then they had half of these individuals change their diet and eat a whole foods diet, a diet that had a lot of unprocessed, real raw fruits and vegetables, cooked fruits and vegetables, but real non-processed food. And what they found is that within a couple of weeks, their gut bacteria actually came back to health. They found that if they switched back to a standard American diet, after 3 days, their gut bacteria switched back again. So within 3 days, they were back to the bad guys. It took them a couple of weeks to get back to the good ones. But the real secret here is to actually eat real foods in order to be well. Just quickly, supplements are not regulated by the FDA, so the quality of supplements matter. I'm giving you a couple of handouts or websites you can look at. This is something you can go back to because you're going to get a PDF of all of this. Probiotics, the quality really varies. Claire Labs and Genestra are two that I really love, and so that's usually one of the most common questions. Products that come from them. There are other good products out there. It's just that I don't have the data on all of them for you. All right, I think now we'll go to the questions and answers.
All right, it seems that there are a lot of questions that have to do with small intestine bacterial overgrowth and probiotics, and so I'm going to start with those because I feel like they affect a lot of people. Sorry, just scrolling down to find the right one here. Do you recommend using probiotics, pills, supplements, or just foods? How does one choose which probiotic to use? This is sort of a common theme. So my goal is always to have individuals have a healthy gut without having to take extra supplements. So probiotics can be really helpful in changing the gut flora and changing the signaling in the gut flora. But the long-term goal is always for us to be able to use whole foods to be able to do that. There was a study done where individuals who had a standard American diet individuals who had a standard American diet, and they tested their gut flora, and then they had them go on a whole foods diet with whole fruits and vegetables, unprocessed foods, and what they found is that within a week, their gut flora had changed to a positive new balance. And what they found is if they stayed on that diet, it stayed, but if they went back to a standard American diet within 2 or 3 days, it went back. And so the goal is always to try to change the diet as much as possible, to use probiotics in the meantime to help to balance that out. So when we look at different kinds of probiotics, I know a lot of people had asked about that. The last slide in the presentation does actually give you a recommendation. I love Claire Labs, and that's with a K, K-L-A-I-R-E, Labs. Therabiotic Complete is a very broad spectrum probiotic that I think is very helpful to a lot of people. And they also have some specialty products. For instance, they have a women's formula. And so I think the quality does matter. I also like Thorne, which has a product called HMF, which is Human Multiflora Forte, which all comes from human bacteria. This is also a good product if someone has some immune suppression or you're worried about them reacting, because these are all the kind of gut bacteria that have come from humans, and so that works really well. New question, any thoughts on taking digestive enzymes? Yes, I often use digestive enzymes, especially when someone has a lot of stress. And what happens is just with stress, we do not digest as well. And so being able to add digestive enzymes in often starts to get the digestive process going. It also, the food is broken down better so that the gut bacteria can work on it better. And it's such a nice way to be able to kind of jumpstart that, especially when there's a lot of stress going on. Question, do you think a consult with a nutritionist would help someone to know help someone know the things you shared? Yes, absolutely. My overall goal with this is not to have everyone know all the details of it. I put the details because it helps us understand what's happening. But my overall goal in putting together this presentation is for people to understand that what we eat and how our digestion is happening is so important to our health. And what I see is when someone has an addiction or a mental health problem, there's so many places in there that the stress of that and the toxicity of that really impacts the digestive system. And once that starts to happen, it's a feed-forward loop that makes things worsen. So yes, I think just basic nutrition, basic paying attention to digestion could help so many people get better, and I think that it should always be included in treatment when someone is going through any kind of mental health problem. With SIBO, question, with SIBO, is the quality of gut bacteria too great or the types disproportionate? Okay, that's a great question. So with small intestine bacterial overgrowth, what's happening is the wrong kind of bacteria are in the wrong place and the wrong qualities. So there are many types of SIBO. SIBO is an overarching thing saying something's off, like dysbiosis. Dysbiosis means the wrong kind of bacteria are in this digestive system. So sometimes they have too many of the wrong kind, sometimes they don't have enough, sometimes they have the gut bacteria are imbalanced because they're eating on something that our body isn't breaking down properly. Like if there's lactose intolerance, and which means that we don't have the proper digestive enzymes to break down lactose, then we're going to get the wrong kind of bacteria that are eating that, and that's going to cause inflammation. So it's an overarching question. When you actually do SIBO testing, you can test for SIBO. You give someone a drink that feeds the bacteria, and then you have them blow into something, and you take samples, and you can actually see by the byproducts what's going on. There's a couple of different kinds of SIBOs, and some of them cause more diarrhea, some cause constipation, and sometimes people have both going on at the same time. So it can manifest in many different ways, but the outcome is that digestion is off and our gut bacteria are off. Question, if you take an antibiotic, should you take acidophilus? If you take an antibiotic, I think that it is important to take a probiotic. So acidophilus is one type of bacteria. It's well studied, it's well understood, but it is just one of the different kinds of bacteria in our gut. And so I usually recommend that people take a broader spectrum probiotic, something that has many different strains, especially because we haven't tested. You can do a digestive stool analysis, for instance, and you can actually look at the kind of bacteria, and then you could see like, oh, they're super low in the acidophilus. Well, then that would be appropriate. If you don't do that, I think taking a more broad spectrum like Therabiotic Complete or HMF Forte is probably a better goal. And yes, every time I have a patient who has an antibiotic, I usually ask them to take a probiotic away from the antibiotic. It's hard if it's 3 times a day. I try to sneak it in, at least a couple of hours away. And then once they're done with the antibiotic, I usually have them take a full bottle, meaning taking it maybe twice a day for a good, 30 days after, just to get things back into to balance. Question, are mushrooms and onions considered probiotics? No. Probiotics are actually bacteria. They are actually bacteria that have been encapsulated and put into a capsule so you can swallow them. So mushrooms and onions are just whole foods that can be good for the gut and have important nutrients, but they're not actually probiotics. So there's a number of questions here, so I'm reading through, that are about sort of the difference between allergies and intolerances. So if you go to an allergist and tell the doctor, hey, I think I have an allergy, what they will do is probably do a skin test, and they are looking for an IgE reaction to see, if we put this on your skin, do you get kind of the red itchy reaction? So food intolerances can actually take many different forms. And so, for instance, it's a food intolerance, like lactose intolerance means that when you consume dairy, your body doesn't have the digestive enzymes to break it down. And so that causes problems because you have unbroken down products that the bacteria attack, and you end up with gas and bloating and often inflammation. Also, if you consume a food, you may not have an IgE reaction. So an IgE reaction is like you bite a strawberry and you get kind of an itchy mouth or even an anaphylactic reaction. An IgG reaction is that your body may not cause itchiness or redness or anything like that, but your body may be attacking it with IgG, which is the part of your immune system that's supposed to be attacking your bacteria and viruses and fungus. And so what happens then is you may just get inflammation. And so it's attacking the food because it doesn't know that the food is harmless, and then you end up with secondary damage. So there's many kinds of allergies. I typically do not find the skin tests are helpful when I'm worried about digestive issues, because people know what they're allergic to. They know if they eat a peanut that they get an anaphylactic reaction or an itchy mouth. That's really obvious. I'm usually looking more for, I eat dairy and then I get bloating or discomfort later, or I eat a potato and my joints swell up 2 days later. And so you need to have a broader view of that. Intolerance could mean that for whatever reason, and it could be because you don't have the right digestive enzymes or part of your immune system is attacking it, or because the food is setting off an inflammatory reaction. That's what's going on. There's also a question about what is leaky gut. So our digestive system is designed to have tight junctions between the cells in our lining. So if you imagine that it's the same as if you have like a Ziploc bag. And so our digestive system should actually be tight and not let big molecules in. It has transport molecules to be able to sort of reach in and let certain nutrients through. Once you have inflammation in the gut, it's sort of like having holes between those cells. And so it would be like having a plastic bag and you have some liquid in it, but someone's poked some holes in it. And so just anything could leak through. So when you have leaky gut, what happens is that larger molecules, so for instance, if you eat a piece of chicken, it should be broken down to amino acids, and those amino acids should be transported over. If you have leaky gut, then big protein molecules can get into the body, and once that happens, then your body can start attacking the chicken because it sees it as that complex protein as an invader instead of something that just hasn't been broken down properly. All right, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you here, and I hope you enjoyed the information. Bye.